Welcome, everyone, to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. A quick note before we start. This session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube with a link on our website, ICSSmarx.org, within the next few days. In pre-pandemic times, this weekly program was hosted for 15 years at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland, California, USA. We now meet every Sunday morning on Zoom. You can sign up for email notifications for future programs, view video recordings of past programs at our website, ICSSmarx.org. And I'd like to start off by saying that we always welcome input, feedback, and suggestion for topics and speakers. You can contact us through a contact form on our website, ICSSmarx.org. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the program committee that organizes these Sunday morning programs. Since we're now on Zoom, we now have speakers and participants from throughout the US and around the world. So I want to wish you all good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Before we start, I want to remind you that this is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. As such, we ask that you show respect for our participants and the moderator of today's session. Please note that the opinions expressed are those of the speaker and participants. They do not necessarily represent those of the ICSS or the Marxist Library. Our session today is going to be a group discussion on weaponizing anti-Semitism, a very timely topic. We're going to start off with a short introduction, which I will make, followed by presentations by three members of the planning committee on different aspects of this topic. And then we're going to open it up for discussion afterwards, after a brief intermission for announcements. Just to keep in mind that the format is less of a Q&A format during the discussion period and more of a discussion. So we're going to encourage people to jump in, express opinions, ask questions, and even have interactions between participants. So with that, I think I will get started with presentation. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to try to do this from inside of quote unquote PowerPoint, which I haven't done before. So this should be interesting. Can you see my screen now?
It looks good.
Okay, good. Okay, so today we're having a group discussion, presentations and a group discussion on weaponizing anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a big topic. It's in the news. It's being talked about all over the place. This is an example of a CNN story that headlines this, that there's a new wave of anti-Semitism that threatens to rock an already unstable world. Oops. Before we begin, I just want to make a quick note as far as this introductory part of the presentation. One of the things that I'm doing here is I want to try to frame the discussion by talking about this sort of wave of anti-Semitism that's being talked about in the media. And in doing so, I have to remind people that we live in a system of tremendous media consolidation where 90% of what we read, watch, and listen to is now controlled by 6 media giants. And these are them: Comcast, Disney, Time Warner, Fox, CBS, and Viacom. This is really, not only is this really a presentation about a topic of weaponizing anti-Semitism, it's also about how issues are framed and how propaganda is generated and propagated in our society today. In fact, in addition to these media monopolies, we also have big tech monopolies like Apple, Google, Facebook, YouTube, etc., that are really shaping, not just shaping, but really determining what we hear and see. And I think you're going to see this coming out very quickly, very clearly in today's presentation. Okay, so here it is. Anti-Semitism surge worldwide. This is actually a story in Reuters that went through a list of 15 countries. I won't bore you with the list, but it's basically creating this idea that anti-Semitism is exploding in countries around the world, and they sort of broke it down by country with story after story of how there's this new wave of anti-Semitism that's taking place both in the US and worldwide. And you can kind of see these are some of the images that I took from various stories that I looked at. Basically, they show a group of Jews demonstrating, or sympathizers to Israel, I should say, sympathizing at a demonstration, concerned about anti-Semitism, signs and demonstrations talking about attacks against Jews, stop Jew hatred, stop anti-Semitism now. This is a big thing. I think we've all seen it if you're at all tuned into the mainstream media. In fact, the events of October 7th are being framed as sort of what's spurring on this wave of anti-Semitism. In other words, it's anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews that sparked the military Operation Aqsa Flood on October 7th, and is actually sparking and generating this wave of anti-Semitism around the world. So the first point I want to make is that this is being tied into the Palestinian resistance that's taking place now. And this is what's generating the anti-Semitism, according to the mainstream media. Politicians have stepped up to take up the fight. Joe Biden has denounced anti-Semitic attacks amid Israel-Gaza conflict. Whoops, hold on a second. Sorry. Had a strange interruption there. Politicians have stepped in, taking up the fight against anti-Semitism. Here's Joe Biden denouncing the rise in anti-Semitic attacks amid the Israel-Gaza conflict. Joe Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, has come out and labeled anti-genocide student protesters as aiders and abettors of anti-Semitism. Aiders and abettors of anti-Semitism. Let me just read a quick quote here. Anti-Semites are taking advantage of the pro-Palestinian movement to espouse hatred and bigotry towards Jewish people, Schumer has asserted. There's a lot of articles appearing in the media about the fear, the threats that Jewish students on campuses across the United States are experiencing in the wake of pro-Palestinian demonstrations that are taking place on campuses across the country. And this is an example at Cornell University of a group of students who are protesting, story after story after story, emphasizing and highlighting Jewish students and what they're feeling on campus as a result of what's taking place. Very little mentioned at first about how Arab students, Palestinian students, and students who are supporting the Palestinian cause are feeling threatened or harassed on campus. This actually got to the point where it was so ridiculous that there was actually a bit of a backlash against it, and stories did start to come out about Palestinian, pro-Palestinian students being threatened and harassed. In fact, what's actually taking place is a systematic, widespread attacks on pro-Palestinian demonstrators and resistors on campuses and in general within the US and around the world. I'm going to go through and I'm going to run down a few, some examples of this. This is one of the more obnoxious and kind of striking attacks that took place. Harvard students who participated in a pro-Palestinian demonstration were met the next day by a group of doxing trucks that were driving around the edge of campus and parked in front of students who had been identified as participating in, leading, and speaking at these pro-Palestine demonstrations at Harvard. Doxing means, this is something on the internet, for those of you who don't know, where you get the personal information of students and then you publish it. You publish it on the internet for basically exposing people to widespread harassment and attacks. And you can kind of make out from this image that they show a photo of the student, they show the name of the student, and then they talk about these are the anti-Semites that are active on campus. And there was a group of trucks that were doing this around Harvard. In addition to that, students at Harvard, well, also at Columbia University, there was a series of demonstrations sponsored by Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine. And a law firm came out and said that the students that were involved in those protests and the ones at Harvard who had been offered jobs with the David Polk law firm, had their job offers rescinded, allegedly for, quote unquote, for supporting, for blaming Israel for the violence in Palestine. So students who participated in demonstrations, law students at both Columbia and Harvard, had job offers that were rescinded. There was a big blowback against this too, pushback, and they've kind of waffled on it, but it has been taking place, and it did take place. One of the more striking examples of this did happen at Columbia University. Columbia University suspended Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine. This is the headline here, school cites infractions culminating in unauthorized event that included threatening rhetoric and intimidation, JVP and SJP events held accusing Israel of, quote, genocide in Gaza. I would call your attention to the quotation marks around genocide. This is something that I noticed in almost every article that discussed this issue, that demonstrators who are calling attention to the genocide that's taking place in Palestine, it's always in quotes. In this case, these are two fairly mainstream organizations. One of them is a Jewish Voice for Peace. Obviously, it's a national pro-Palestinian anti-Zionist Jewish organization banned from campus activities. SJP banned from campus activities. In addition to attacks on students who are involved in pro-Palestinian demonstration, there have also been attacks on celebrities and public figures who have faced repercussion for posting about Palestinians. And I just put this up here because this is just an article from BuzzFeed that this was such a widespread phenomenon that even in the mainstream press, it made the front page of BuzzFeed that these types of things are happening. Let me just show you a few of them that are taking place. One of the most notorious ones was Susan Sarandon, who spoke at a pro-Palestine rally, I believe it was in New York, and was dropped by her talent agency, United Talent, actually, let me read this statement because I'll come back to it later on. While condemning anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, she reportedly said, quote, "There are a lot of people afraid of being Jewish at this time and are getting a taste of what it feels like to be a Muslim in this country, so often subjected to violence." This made a pretty big news story. She eventually apologized, and I'll come back to that too, but for that particular statement. But she basically was dropped from her talent agency for speaking at this demonstration. Another very notorious example is that of Melissa Barrera, who was dropped from Scream 7. I don't know how many of you are aware that's a very popular series, streaming series on the internet. And there was like protests against her statements, and she made some very strong statements. Let me just give you some examples here. Western media only shows the Israeli side. Why do they do that? I will let you deduce that yourself, she wrote in October. A spokesperson for Spyglass Media Group, the company behind Scream, subsequently told Variety that Spyglass's stance is unequivocally clear. We have zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, for the incitement of hate in any form, including false references to genocide, ethnic cleansing, Holocaust distortion, or anything flagrantly crossing the line into hate speech. And let me just give you an example of the hate speech that she was removed from this program. I condemn anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. I condemn hate and prejudice of any kind against any group of people. Melissa wrote on Instagram, "As a Latina, a proud Latina, I feel responsibility of having a platform that allows me the privilege of being heard. And I therefore have to raise awareness about issues I care about and lend my voice to those in need." Pretty mild stuff, get dropped from basically your livelihood. The Dutch Palestinian actress Bella Haddad has also been attacked. She's been sent hundreds of death threats, phone numbers. She's been doxxed. Her family has been threatened, but she has spoken out. So this is a case of a model, a prominent Palestinian model. And she said, "The people and children of Palestine, especially in Gaza, cannot afford our silence." And then finally, Viet Thanh Nguyen, a Pulitzer Prize winning novelist. He was supposed to speak at an event in New York City. It was canceled. I won't go into it, but basically, another example of being dropped. This is one that I wanted to call your attention to. This is a particularly notorious one. The author of a recently published novel, Adiana Shibli, a Palestinian author, wrote a novel called Minor Detail. She was slated to receive the 223 Le Bon Tour Award at the Frankfurt Book Festival in October, but this was canceled at the last moment. And really, why was this canceled? It's a short novel, and it deals with a true story, the story of an atrocity that was committed by Israeli soldiers during the Nakba in 1949, during the Israeli War of Independence. And basically, it was a story of an Israeli military unit that was cleansing the area of Arabs, ran into a group of nomadic Bedouin people, shot all of them dead with the exception of one survivor, and had a debate about what would happen to this survivor, which was a young girl. And basically what ended up happening was that they decided to spare her, rape her. They ended up shooting her and burying her in the desert. She wrote a novel about this. It's not a fantasy story. It's not an imaginary story, not made up. This is why she was canceled. Even within the mainstream, figures are being canceled for the mildest of criticisms. MSNBC dropped Mehdi Hasan's show. Mehdi Hasan is a very mainstream Democratic Party aligned liberal who has come out and said that Joe Biden's presidency is the greatest presidency of my lifetime. And he came out with some very mild statements calling attention, excuse me, calling attention to the plight of Palestinians and basically talking about the violence that's taking place in Gaza. He was dropped from his show. People even like him are being dropped and canceled. In addition to that, there's actually the outright outlawing of resistance, of opposition to what's going on in Gaza in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. European countries are banning pro-Palestinian rallies, very, very serious and controversial thing that's taking place. Story about it in Amnesty International. France banned pro-Palestinian protests and vowed to protect Jews from resurgent anti-Semitism. Again, the resistance worldwide targeted under the aegis of protecting Jews from anti-Semitic attacks. A very notorious example of this is the arrest of Dr. Ranjit Brar in London at a demonstration, had a table of books that he was displaying and was arrested for distributing hate literature in London. Ranjit Brar is an eminent London surgeon. He's also the brother of Jyoti Brar, who spoke 2 weeks ago at the library. And mind you, these are some pictures of what happened. Here he's being carted off to jail. Here he's being arrested. He's being arrested not for throwing rocks, not for illegally demonstrating, but for having a book that criticized Zionism on selling that book or distributing that book during the demonstration, taken away and arrested. So what we're going to have today in our presentation is a historical analysis of these events, what's taking place. And it's going to start off with a historical analysis, some personal observations, and some discussion of fighting back, followed at the end by summary conclusion, and then we're going to have some discussion. So with that, we'll go ahead and I'm going to ask Sharon to take over. Go ahead, Sharon.
Thank you. So my contribution to this is to outline what is an historical materialist understanding of Zionism. And it's important to understand the history because there's so much misinformation abounding everywhere. And if even those who are struggling on the right side of this for Palestinian human rights and at the moment struggling for a ceasefire in Gaza, don't have all the facts. And if we are to build that united front in this country and change US policy, then we need to understand the history very well so that we can share it and teach other people. Here's an example of the misinformation that goes around. So in Oakland, where I live, the city council recently, within the last 10 days or so, passed a resolution in favor of a ceasefire, immediate ceasefire. And it's a good resolution. It passed unanimously. There were 300 people lined up to speak in public comment, and the city council sat through listening to all of those people. There was a fight over whether to include a condemnation of Hamas, which ultimately was not included in the final resolution, but it still passed unanimously. But in the course of the discussion among the city council members, one of them said, well, she was arguing for a very, very mildly worded and targeted resolution. She said, this is such a complex controversy. It's been millennia. And we are not in the position to be writing a resolution analyzing all of that. Thousands of years of history of antagonism between Jews and Palestinians. And she went on, well, that is completely wrong. It's not a millennia-old antagonism. The origins of the antagonism are in the age of imperialism, in particular British imperialism. The Zionists have triumphed to the extent that they have been able to define and tell their version of history, equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, as Alan just showed us. But in fact, Zionism is a product of European anti-Semitism and in the age of imperialism. European anti-Semitism. So let me just give a few historical, some dates to get us oriented here. For 600 years, Palestine was a province of the Ottoman Empire. People lived there. There were Jews and Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs. Many were farmers. Many lived in urban centers. Some were specifically carrying on the religious traditions centered around Jerusalem, which is, of course, a center for Christianity and Islam and Judaism. They lived in relative peace. Were they all happy? Well, it was feudalism and the beginnings of capitalist development. So you tell me whether people were happy. That's beside the point. World War I brought the Ottoman Empire to its end, and in its place came the British. The British invented the term Middle East. Why was it middle to them? Because the East was India, where they were plundering to the tune of estimated $45 trillion worth of everything. And so the middle was the passage that they needed to get goods and back and forth to India. they had colonized Egypt in around 1882, and the Suez Canal already existed. It was built in between 1859 and 1869, and they needed, the British were very clear that they needed a bulwark in the Middle East to maintain their access to India. So the Ottomans were defeated, but before that, the British, and I guess by 1917, it was clear that the Western imperialists were going to win. There was the issuance of the Balfour Declaration in November of 1917. And it represented a promise, a public pledge declaring that the aim of British policy was the establishment of a, quote, national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It was a deal that was negotiated by some prominent Zionists in Britain. And one thing about it that needs to be noted is that it used the category non-Jewish to describe the majority of people living in Palestine. So the orientation was that the most important people were the Jewish people there, and everybody else was non-Jewish, and they, said something about how those people had rights too. Now, how many people actually lived in Palestine? The British took a census in 1922, and the British were called the Mandate Government, as they had a mandate from the victors of World War I to rule over this area. The total population was 757,000, of whom 590 something thousand were Muslims, around 84,000 were Jews, and 73,000 were Christian. So again, the Jews were the minority, but everybody else was a non-Jew. Now, what was going on in Europe that was building the colonial enterprise and the settler colonial enterprise that brought people to Palestine? The historical facts prove that Zionism and Zionists did not speak for or represent the aspirations of a people. The Zionist claim that Jews are a nation is not accurate. Let us take a little side step here and consider what is a nation. The Leninist definition, and Lenin had a lot to say about nations and their rights relative to the international working class. The Leninist definition of a nation, it's a contiguous territory where people speak a common language and have a common culture. So there were Jews everywhere, many different places, many in Europe, but also in North Africa, Persia, Asia, the United States, South America. The European Jews did have a common language, Yiddish, which is a version of German written with Hebrew characters. But that not all the European Jews had that language, because there's another Jewish language in Europe, which is essentially Spanish written in Hebrew characters. It's called Ladino. And it emerged from the people who were forced to leave, the Jews who were forced to leave Spain during the Spanish Inquisition and moved eastward mainly to Romania and surrounding areas. The Zionists did not represent every Jewish person, even in Europe, just looking at Europe. There were many other Jewish people who had different ideas about the question. In particular, there was a large group called the Jiddische Arbeiterbund, the Jewish Workers Group. It was particularly big in Poland. They were explicitly anti-Zionist. Their view was Jewish people are part of the international working class. And here in Poland, we're part of the working class. And we want to participate in the movements for workers' rights and power to the working class here in our own country. And they also had some fellow people in other European countries. Here in our own country, we want to participate in the revolution, essentially. The Bund was actually part of the Polish government in exile, which was in London during the war. And after the war, some of the Bund went back to rebuild Poland, but they were not communists. So there was a contradiction between them and those who came to power in Poland. And I don't know that history. I just know there was that contradiction. The archives of the Bund ended up in New York, where I'm sure they still exist for people who can want to do research. I'm sure there has been a lot of research done. When I knew them, everything was in Yiddish, of course. And since I'm a third generation child of third generation immigrants, I didn't speak a word or write any Yiddish, so couldn't read them. I don't know what happened to them, but I'm sure there's been a lot of research. One of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in May 1943 was Marek Edelman, who was a Bundist. And he, in fact, was the lone or one of the only survivors of the leadership of that uprising. The story of that uprising, not to be confused with the Warsaw Uprising a year later, 1944. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, many thousands of people lost their lives, including most of the leadership, some of whom committed suicide. But Marek Edelman survived, And he, to his dying day, he was an anti-Zionist. He died in the year 2009 at the age of 90. His life story is very interesting. You could start by looking him up on Wikipedia. But I'm just talking about the Bund as an example of people who were anti-Zionists, who spoke for large numbers of Jewish people in Europe. But the Zionists triumphed because of the Nazi genocide. So, I'm sorry, I have to go to a different page. At the start of World War II, in September of 1939, there were about 9.5 million Jewish people living in Europe, where they were already under the control of the Nazis or were about to be. 2/3 of those people were slaughtered. So by the end of the war, in May of 1945, there were 3.5 million survivors. Now, some of the survivors died, and I don't have that data, and I don't know where to find it, actually, but many people who survived later died because of what they had suffered, the starvation and everything that they had suffered. They consisted of concentration camp prisoners, about around 300,000, and others who had fought with the partisans, been hidden by other people, or who had escaped to Britain or other countries. It varies a lot, and you can read all about this detail in many places, including the Holocaust Museum in Washington. So 70% of German Jews were killed, and a third of Austrian Jews were killed, and it varied a lot. I'm sure somebody's done a study of exactly why that was. But the refugees ended up, were in, either they had already fled to some country that took them in, like Britain, or they were in displaced persons camps. So Europe was a terrible mess, if we think about it, where the Allies, the Western Allies, were occupiers or had forces there. Some Jewish people fled east to the Soviet Union, and within the Soviet Union, people were moved east to protect them. And just as the Soviets moved whole factories eastward. Just think about moving a tank factory from the east, where the Germans were about to come in. That is from the west, where the Germans were about to come in eastward to rebuild it, to have a tank factory. There's a slander against the Soviets that says that they force those Jewish people to migrate eastward. Yeah, they forced them to save their lives. So there were massive numbers of people in displaced persons camps, and where were they going to go? So most of them did not want to go back to where they had come from, because there was nothing there for them. They certainly felt that there was nothing there for them. And they didn't have many options. The United States was not offering itself as a haven. In 1948, there was a Immigration Act passed, which gave some refuge to some of the displaced people. It was about 200 and something thousand that ended up coming here. But in order to get here, you had to essentially be sponsored by someone. So, and what did that mean? My parents and some members of the family signed a sponsorship for some distant relatives who had actually spent the war in London. They had come from Austria. And what you signed was that the person that you were sponsoring would not become a ward of the state. So essentially would not go on welfare, that you would take care of them when they got here. Anyway, that was far from the majority. It was a small token in terms of the need of people in Europe to be resettled, to rebuild their lives and to be able to continue their lives. So the Zionists took advantage of all of that and started bringing people to Palestine. Now, the British, who had signed the Balfour Declaration and everything, actually made a show of not letting those people in. And I frankly don't understand the politics of that. But they blockaded the ports. So what happened was, what the Zionists did was they organized ships from Mediterranean ports. Marseille was the biggest one, but there were others. And so people walked across Europe, and I knew people who told me that. We walked across Europe and got on a boat. The Zionists make a big deal about how all these people were yearning for their national homeland. I'm sure some of them were. Most of them were just scared to death and wanted any place of refuge that they were offered as survivors of what had happened. And if they'd had their druthers, they would have come to the United States. And I knew a few people who actually went to Palestine and then came to the United States. This is the only way I would have known them. But nobody took a poll of these people. The Zionists got to speak for them. So the British made a big show of blockading the ports, Haifa in particular. But the Zionists were very clever, and they were able to get around that. And it might have been that the British were really looking the other way. In any case, that's how many of the displaced people ended up in Palestine.
We're getting pretty close to
yes, and I'm pretty close to wrapping this up. So what I want to do is just reiterate what we need to understand. Zionism is not a worldwide movement of every Jewish person. It's a product of European anti-Semitism and British imperialism and Western imperialism. The antagonism is not between Arabs and Jews, or however you want to describe it, Jews and Muslims, whatever, however that antagonism is described. It's not a millennial-old thing. It originates in the age of imperialism. And the answer to the Jewish question is not Zionism. I'll stop there.
Okay, let's go ahead and Roger, if you would go ahead and give your talk.
Okay, thank you. My presentation will be more of a personal presentation, and I'll start with a famous quote that Woody Allen made. Woody Allen was accused of being a self-loathing Jew, and what Woody Allen said was, I have a lot of things to be self-loathing about, but being Jewish is not one of them. And I want to make clear that I'm very proud of my heritage and very proud of the anti-Zionist Jews that are standing up in solidarity with the Palestinians. What I want to speak about is self-loathing, but this is the self-loathing of Zionism, which I think is an ideology of self-loathing. And it's based on an article that I published recently. It was in Counterpunch and various other publications like that. And the story starts with the first time I was going to go to Europe. And I was very close to my grandmother, and she's from Europe. So I said, grandmother, I'm going to go to Europe. And she said, Oy vey. She exclaimed, her voice was raised. She said, there's nothing in Europe. There's just poverty and filth. And then she collected herself and she said, you like foreign food? There's better food in New York City. For her generation of Jews, there was little nostalgia for the old country, and it was for good reason. She had been an involuntary participant in pogroms of those violent riots massacring Jews. And if we fast forward to the present, the anti-Semitic perpetrators of some of those pogroms are today being rehabilitated. For example, Vladimir Zelensky, disregarding his own religious heritage, honors the murderous Stephen Bandera as one of his, quote, indisputable heroes. So going back to my grandmother, she came to these shores and she became a fancy American lady. Her friends came to call her Fanny. I think it was after Fanny Brice, who was a popular movie star. That was a sophisticated American name. She didn't like her other name, her given name, which was Felicia, which actually I think was quite beautiful. But for that generation of Jews, there was no going back. And for the diverse melange of ethnic groups that comprise the so-called American melting pot, the Jews, to the extent that you can generalize about any group, are unique in having no affection for whence they came. Those old folks would say in their most cynical moments, if you ask them, where do you come from? They said, I came from hunger. Maybe some of you had that same childhood experience. In my case, I don't even know where all my relatives came from. As a child, you kind of intuitively learn that some subjects are out of bounds, and you don't ask them, you don't press on them. It's a verboten topic. Now those people are gone, and I wish I had asked them more about their early life, but that's been lost. And the point, though, is my relatives had no intention of returning to Europe, but they still retained the culture that they brought with them, and they passed it on. Also, those old folks, they didn't have a particular interest in Zionism, at least not in my family. However, for many of my co-religionists today, the tradition of the European Jewish culture is being replaced by what I would argue is a Disney-esque synthetic political Zionism. And I make a clear distinction between political Zionism and the religion of Judaism. These are two different things. The critique here is of political Zionism, the political ideology, and not of the religion or its practitioners. Zionism is a response to a rejection of the European culture. The shame and pain in the past is buried in the Zionist conceit. Let's take the ideal of the Jewish scholar. That's been discarded for the veneration of the Jewish warrior. We no longer identify, many of us, particularly the Zionists, we don't identify as the people of the book anymore. The Zionist is proud to be a gun bearer. Grace and mercy have made way for virgins of grace and mercy have made way for a vengeance of biblical proportions. And we see that as I'm speaking right now. The Zionist state is unapologetically nuclear armed. It is a leading world purveyor of cluster bombs, of surveillance equipment, and of policing technology. And take our warm Yiddish language with its rich literature, theater, song, that's been cast off. And also tellingly vanishing is its humor and humanity, and a somewhat self-deprecating humility. In its place is a former liturgical language, Hebrew, unearthed from the cold catacombs. The new tongue is a deliberate part of the break from a tradition in a project to build a new identity that escapes from its past. Zionism, as we know, rests on the mythos of a supreme being who chose a particular people to establish a nation on the eastern Mediterranean coast. More political than religious, Zionism posits a basic antagonism between Jews and others, necessitating an exclusive state to defend the former against the rest. And this is key, this basic antagonism, to understanding the essential core of Zionism. Fundamental is the bedrock belief that the world hates the Jews. Consequently, Jewish security can only be achieved by aggression toward the other. And I've been, in preparation for this program, I've been immersing myself in reading the writings and journals of the Zionists who criticize anti-Zionism. And one of the things I keep on raising is that the Jews who are anti-Zionist, they don't really understand that people really hate Jews, and it's inherent. And sometimes they can hide it, but if you root it out, you'll find out that deep down, the enemy is all of the humanity against the Jews. And I see this time and again in the literature of the people that are supporting Zionism and criticizing those Jews who have broken with Zionism. Zionism was long one of the many currents in the Jewish diaspora Sharon Rose just explained. But with World War II and the Holocaust, Zionism got legs and became the dominant current. It's still disputed in some circles, but today it really is the dominant ideology of much of the Jewish diaspora, and certainly the ideology of the Zionist state. Making Aliyah, some of you might know that expression. Making Aliyah is a return to what is described as our motherland, land of our origins per the Zionists. Aliyah is one of the most basic tenets of Zionism. However, genetic evidence shows that the European Jews never occupied the occupied territories. We can't go back to a place that was never ours. And for me, I went to the 23andMe and did that DNA test, and I found out that I was 99.7% Ashkenaz Jew, and then 0.3% Northern European genes. But I did not have a single drop of Semitic blood from the Levant region. Yet I have the right, according to Israeli law, to be a full Israeli citizen, while millions of native-born Palestinians are excluded from the land of their ancestors. The European settlers who immigrated in part as part of the Zionist project to the territory now claimed by Israel were not descendants of the Jewish people depicted in the Bible. Rather, they were in all likelihood the descendants of converts to Judaism. Let me quote Chaim Weizmann. He was the president of the World Zionist Congress, and he made this statement back in 1914. Quote, "There is a country that happens to be called Palestine, a country without a people. And on the other hand, there exists the Jewish people, and it has no country. What else is necessary then than to fit the gem into the ring and unite this people with this country. This is the Zionist mantra, a country without a people for a people without a country. Of course, there's the inconvenient existence of the indigenous people who lived there and had done so for millennia. But to the settler colonialists that now head the Zionist state, these indigenous people are literally animals. And we're hearing that daily from the Israelis who are justifying their current genocide. As I recite this, these, quote, Untermenschen are being cleansed out. And they're being cleansed out with our tax dollars and with our government's full complicity. The narrow nationalist and xenophobic tribalism of Zionism contrasts with the universal humanism of the Jewish culture. Some of you might be familiar of the Passover ceremony and the welcoming of the stranger. In traditional Jewish culture, a seat was added to the family table for a stranger on Passover, this religious feast day. And this beautiful ritual was explicitly designed to engender sympathy for others. The Torah reminds us that as those who have not renounced their past, and I quote from the Torah, Exodus 23:9, "You shall not oppress the stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt." Yes, you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not oppress the stranger. That is why many anti-Zionist Jews in today's political context resonate with the slogan, "We are all Palestinians." Over time, the Zionists have achieved a horrific conversion of an oppressed people becoming the oppressor. But how could they have done this? But they could not have done this transformation alone. And this is the key point. The political ideology of Zionism had to be inseparably joined in a seamless union with US imperialism. As President Biden recently emphasized, making sure Israel and Ukraine succeed is vital to America's national security. President Biden has famously and repeatedly said, quote, "Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect our interest in the region." Similarly, Biden has repeatedly boasted there's, quote, "no daylight between the United States and Israel." That is, the US imperial project and the Zionist project are one and the same, a unified whole. Endless war is the prescription for the US imperial Zionist joint project. A ceasefire, let alone peace with justice, is completely off the table. Perversely, political Zionism has instrumentalized Jewish identity into a tool of the empire. And let me just repeat that, because that's the key point here. Political Zionism has instrumentalized Jewish identity into a tool of empire. Paradoxically, some of the biggest fans of modern Zionism outside the Jewish community are anti-Semitic. They love the apartheid state because of its institutionalized racism, not in spite of it. International bullies are bullish about the so-called promised land. But there's a good side too. Growing numbers of us still embrace our ancestral identity, and especially in light of current events, have wholly renounced its self-loathing antithesis of Zionism. For example, the activist organization of Jewish Voice of Peace is becoming a very strong and surging current in the Jewish diaspora of a proud anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist Jewish identity. Let me conclude by saying that what the Nazis failed to achieve, the obliteration of the European Jewish culture, the Zionists are carrying forward. We have a word for that in Yiddish. It's a shanda, a scandalous embarrassment and shame. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Richard, go ahead. This is our last presentation. Go ahead.
Yeah, Well, I don't have much to add to the excellent presentations by Roger and Sharon. Alan asked me to add a personal note to this discussion. I'm not quite sure what he meant, but I will say that both my parents were what are called survivors of the Holocaust. Both narrowly escaped the gas chambers, and where most of their family and extended family and social circles were wiped out, and ended up in Great Britain, where I grew up. And so my connection with the topic, which is the the weaponization of the accusation of anti-Semitism, naturally turns to where I grew up. And the first thing I thought about was the case of Jeremy Corbyn in Britain. If many of you, some of you might not know, let me just run through it quickly. After the takeover of the Labour Party in Britain, the Socialist, what was called also the Socialist Party, by basically capital, there was a big upsurge among the membership of the Labour Party, and by a fluke, one of their members, one of their working class, middle class members, was elected leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, who was a member of Parliament, and he would have been in line to be Prime Minister of Britain if the Labour Party had been elected in a majority, and he almost certainly would have, because his program was a very popular one. As a result, as a consequence, there was an enormous campaign against him, which the keystone of it was his alleged, if not personal anti-Semitism, his tolerance of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And when I first heard about it, I thought there's nothing more ridiculous. Nobody would pay any attention to that, because the Labour Party, and particularly his wing of the Labour Party, was intimately involved with had been intertwined, almost identified with the progressive parts of the Jewish community. And I found it hard to believe that anybody would believe that kind of accusation. But in fact, as you know, he was successfully removed using that accusation of anti-Semitism of the cover. It wasn't even particularly around the Israel-Palestine question. It was any participation of the working class in the British political system. That's had to be destroyed, just as it has been destroyed in the United States. Both parties have expelled and marginalized all working class and progressive tendencies in the United States and Europe. So, that's one example of the use of that trope in political struggles, in the class struggles. One sidelight of this I thought about is, in fact, also the struggle against anti-Semitism is sidelined by this. There's no real struggle against anti-Semitism. The main sources, as Sharon pointed out, of anti-Semitism in Western Europe are the feudal relics. In Britain, it's the landed aristocracy, certain sections of the Christian church. these are the well springs of anti-Semitism that haven't been eradicated, and there's no, it's ignored. It's just part of the people take it for granted, and there's no struggle against it. That part of British society and part of the American society is anti-Semitic. Those sections of the ruling class that identify with Britain particularly, it's taken for granted among themselves and everybody else that they're anti-Semitic. And same here. So it's as Roger pointed out, it's a self-destructive, even for Jews themselves. Never mind the people who manipulate them among the ruling class for their own ends. So I'll leave it right there, and I look forward to the discussion in general.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, let me go ahead and do a quick summary of some of the points that have come up today, and then we're going to move into the discussion part of today's session. What I would say in summary of all the speeches that have been given is that number one, Palestinian resistance and support for the Palestinians does not flow from anti-Jewish hatred or anti-Semitism, that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Judaism is a religion. Jewish people do not constitute a nation and have no primary or exclusive claim to the territory of Palestine. The mainstream campaign against anti-Semitism, quote unquote, is really a smokescreen that's being used by Zionists and their backers, US imperialism, to promote imperial interests. The campaign against anti-Semitism is being used to suppress opposition and resistance to their genocidal war against the Palestinians, and that fighting anti-Semitism, quote, is being used as a weapon in the service of imperialism. And in fact, as Richard just pointed out, it serves to incite hatred against Jews. So with that, we'll just take a short break for quick announcements, and then we'll go to Q&A. I want to remind people that you can click on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand if you want to participate. This is going to be kind of like more of a discussion than a Q&A, but go ahead and raise your hand if you have things to contribute or questions. I want to, just by way of announcements, our next program hasn't been set yet. What I would urge you to do is, if you're not already signed up for our email notification system, go to our website, ICSSmarx.org, and you will receive an email notification of our programs for next week and from now on. But we'll be getting back to you shortly. We have a few things on tap, and we'll get that settled. You can also go to our website to contact us for any reason using the contact form, ICSSmarx.org. Okay, with that, let's go to Q&A, and just hang on one second. I'll change the settings so that people can unmute themselves. Okay, and let's start off with Kit, followed by Michael Karsh. So Kit, please go ahead. Unmute yourself. Kit? Okay, let's go ahead with Michael. We can come back to Kit. Michael, if you would unmute yourself. Michael? Whoop, hold on. Actually, let's go back to Kit. Kit, go ahead. There.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I needed to be unmuted. This has been an excellent presentation. I want to thank all the
Can you turn on your audio
about this?
Your video too?
Okay. I want to thank all the presenters about this. There should be a transcription for this if it's possible. My note taking is not that great, but when I first looked up the word Semitic, I looked at the Merriam-Webster definition, and it includes, as Sharon was talking about the history, it includes a broad range of people from that part of the world, and it's not exclusive to the Jewish people. So the Oxford reference for Semites in the Bible, a member of any of the people who speak or spoke a Semitic language includes Jews and Arabs. So, that changed in the 1880s, I believe, where the definition of anti-Semitism was defined as being exclusively about the Jewish people. Anyway, that was something I had looked up before this talk. There's some questions I have. Sharon, and you guys can also put this in the chat. I'm just curious who that Oakland City Council person was who made that statement during the vote against the Gaza issue.
It was Carol Fife.
Carol? Oh, okay.
Carol.
Thank you.
I believe it was Nikki Bass. It
Okay.
doesn't matter. And I was not quoting her directly. I don't have the exact quote. I just wanted to emphasize that she was saying that it's millennial.
Okay, there apparently needs to be a lot of education, and I think we can take care of that. I think this kind of panel needs to happen again, really. People need to be educated. Not many people know about the Zionism or have thought about it until now, I think. I mean, I grew up in a very religious Catholic culture, and we learned about Jewish traditions, through the Bible. The Passover was something that we learned about quite in depth about. So it's not something that's unfamiliar to people that are of the Christian persuasion, especially if you've been really indoctrinated in that. And then I think there was a quote too that Roger had, if he could put that in the chat, that you repeated twice. I couldn't write that all down. But anyway, I can't even find my notes about that. Political ideology. Well, anyway, Roger, you know which quote that is.
I'm sorry, I'm
I
not
would like
quite
folks
clear.
to comment about the connection between the right-wing Protestant evangelicals and Zionism, because I know that they play a very strong role in terms of persuading people to be more Zionistic. So anyway, those are my questions. Thank you very much. And I hope you can present this information to another audience that is outside of this. Thank you.
Okay, Roger, if you could maybe have a back and forth on chat to try to.
I'll put a link to my article.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Anything on comments on Christian Zionism that people? One fact that I think is quite interesting is there are actually, this is something that I had recently read. I haven't looked into this, but there are actually more Christian Zionists in the United States than there are Jews in the United States, and therefore definitely more Christian Zionists than Jewish Zionists. So this is a definite political statement, and it's something that really ties in with the interests of imperialism in the United States. Okay, next is Michael, followed by Janet. So Michael, if you would go ahead, please.
Okay. I thought the last speaker talked about how they successfully got rid of Jeremy Corbyn. I thought that while it's true he didn't handle the anti-Semitism allegations correctly, what he should have done is force them to give him a specific allegation, and then he'd look into that. And then, but I thought what really brought him down was calling for the second Brexit referendum. I mean, I thought Jeremy Corbyn might have won. The Labour Party might have won had he not done that. In fact, I thought they gained seats in 2017, even though they didn't take back the government. I thought the whole reason why they lost was actually mainly that he called for a second Brexit referendum.
Okay. Next up is Janet. You'd unmute. There you go.
Sorry. Okay, so first, I have a lot to say. I don't know. Anyway, I was at the November 27th Oakland City Council meeting the whole time and heard everything. And I wrote up what happened there. And I'm going to post in the chat the archive of that meeting and the times when Carol Fife spoke, and that's when you'll hear what she said. And it wasn't Nikki Bass who spoke.
Thank you, Janet, for correcting me about that.
Yeah. Anyway, I have been following Shahid Bolson, who lives in Malaysia. He's very interesting analyst, commenter about a number of things. Anyway, he posted something, and I think in the last ICSS. Anyway, in the last session, Alan played something by him. One of his he does these short videos. It's titled "Nothing is More Anti-Semitic Than Zionism," and it's pretty interesting. I will include that in the chat as well. I wanted to respond to something that Alan talked about. So you talked about doxing. There is something called the Canary Mission. You've probably heard of that. And that's what is behind, especially the doxing of students. And it's funded by the Jewish Community Federation in San Francisco. And that was talked about, I don't know, a number of years ago, but it's become more prominent now. Also, in terms of personalities who are being attacked, Roger Waters is, well, I mean, he's always speaking up in support of Palestinians, but he's another who's been attacked, I think, taken off of X, Twitter, and etc. I wanted to also follow up on something that Richard talked about, Jeremy Corbyn's ouster, which was, I think, 2015. I'm not sure, 2015, 2016. That was around the same time there was a definition of anti-Semitism that was approved and published by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA. And the briefly, or I'm going to quote, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. And then to guide the IHRA in its work, the following examples may serve as illustrations. Manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism frequently charges Jews with conspiring to harm humanity and it is often used to blame Jews for, quote, why things go wrong. It is expressed in speech, writing, visual forms, and action, and employs sinister stereotypes and negative character traits. I'll post a link to that. I mean, there's much more detail about that, but that having been passed by the IHRA in Budapest in 2016 led the British Parliament to approve that definition and use that to against any kind of anti-Zionist behavior. It led to laws in further laws in other countries in Europe and in the United States in support of Israel and against anti-Zionist activities like BDS, job requirements, and censorship. And then I'll end with bringing up something that happened recently. There was a post or an article that titled "Facebook approved an Israeli ad calling for assassination of pro-Palestine activist." After the ad was discovered, digital rights advocates ran an experiment testing the limits of Facebook's machine learning moderation. That activist is Paul LaRudy. I think some of you might know Paul LaRudy. I would really like it if he could be invited to talk, give a presentation at some point. We can follow up on that later. The ad was placed by AdKan, AdKan, which appears to be the IDF equivalent of Ukraine's Mirotvorets list. I mean, going after, trying to assassinate. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Okay, just a quick comment in response to what Janet just said. I think that the organized effort to suppress criticism of Israel is so much further than anything we've even talked about here today. I would encourage people to look into Operation Butterfly, which was organized by Sheldon Adelson and some other very powerful and wealthy individuals who are within the Zionist, Jewish supporters of the Zionist movement. And literally they spent tens of millions of dollars, recruited agents to track down, dox, track, record, and harm them, discredit them. And this is something that just goes on at a governmental level, at the level of Zionist organizations. We haven't even begun to talk about this here, with everything that we've talked about. I would also note that all of these people they received money from the Israeli government. And there has been no talk of any of these people being indicted as being agents of Israel, right? But who's been indicted for being agents of Israel? The people from the Uhuru movement who received, I think it was several $100s for attending a conference in Russia. So, I think that really one of the things that we have to realize is that this is not just a set of ideas that are out there. This is a set of ideas that has very powerful, comprehensive, and aggressive backing from a variety of sources. Okay, so next up is Citizen One, followed by Gene.
Alan, if I could interject just a little
please.
bit on that same topic. And just to mention another example of what Janet was speaking about, and this comes from the American Jewish Committee, and they have, I could put the reference into the chat, but they defined what anti-Semitism is. And what they talked about is that a particularly insidious form of anti-Semitism disguises itself as animus toward Israel. So anti-Semitism is defined as an animus toward Israel. And so a lot of these reports we hear about the surge of anti-Semitism is conflated with any criticism of Israel. So the American Jewish Committee goes on to say examples of this is declaring Israel a racist state. Now that certainly is animus against Israel, but it is, I would think, a legitimate question to ask, and not a question of hatred. It's really a question that should be raised and examined. This is not a minor thing. The American Jewish Committee says that this is, quote, their working definition of anti-Semitism, and it has been adopted by over 30 countries over the world, including the U.S. Department of State. I'll end there.
Okay, next is Citizen One, followed by Jean.
Okay. Yep, I guess I'm heard. First of all, like everyone, there's a lot to say on this, so please let me know when I only have about 30 seconds remaining. I'd like to say for the audio archive audience that I posted in chat a video from YouTube called Jewish in Diaspora Realizing That They've Been Lied To. So it doesn't say Jews, it says Jewish in Diaspora Realizing They've Been Lied To. So you can look that up on YouTube. It's 23 minutes and 38 seconds long. The other thing I posted in chat that people should listen to is Gandhi's Statement on Palestine, 1938. Again, that's called Statement on Palestine, 1938. And another reference I'll give can be found at Consortium News. Pro-Israel trolls, mob social media. And the blurb under the title is, while it kills thousands of people in Gaza, Israel is spending millions of dollars on its public image on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, writes Alan McLeod. The blitz includes an invasion of the community notes function on X/Twitter. I would like to first say, the irony to me is that any real Western anti-Semites would want all the Jews to move to Israel from their Western countries, just like racists want and tell Black people, go back to Africa. So I find that kind of an irony. The other thing I want to say is that the ancient Hebrews weren't even the first or only people in historic Palestine, as many of you may know. And the Zionists act like they were. Now, I was raised Roman Catholic, which means they didn't teach us about the Bible, but I once heard a biblical reference about, and quote, God, unquote, told, quote, Moses, unquote, to go to Canaan and massacre every last Canaanite to conquer the land and take over ancient Palestine. So for those of you who may know your Bible better than I do, you can offer any comment or correction to that. But once again, that points out they weren't even the first or only people in Palestine. This thing about, an ancient conflict between, Palestinians and Jews. You all may not know, unless you watch, awful commercial TV evening news, that this is something that in particular Dan Rather used to repeat all the time whenever he completed an end of the broadcast news about Israel. And this is something that the anchors of the other two major legacy networks, and as I'm sure others, I think I've heard it on the BBC and Sky News, that they always end with this. And thus another story in the ancient millennial conflict between Arabs/Palestinians and Jews. I want to say about people who've stepped forward besides that, I put it, I don't know if I mentioned it, but I put it in the chat about, I forgot her name, the Canadian filmmaker and it can be found on YouTube. I'm sorry, someone jump in and let me know if I did put it in the chat. But the Canadian Jewish filmmaker who said that she was renouncing her Israeli citizenship. So I forgot her name. Her first name is Eula, Y-U-U-L-A, and I forgot her last name. But you can find it at YouTube if I didn't get it posted, and I'll post it if I see I didn't. Publicly renounced her Israeli citizenship. So not every celebrity is afraid to come out, and I'm sure Susan Sarandon wasn't either, afraid to come out and criticize Zionism. Also, for those of you who don't know or don't watch NBA basketball, a very famous basketball player, African-American basketball player named Kyrie Irving, publicly appeared during a press conference with a Palestinian keffiyeh on. So he's not worried about standing up for Palestinians.
Joseph, it's Janet. I just posted the Jewish filmmaker.
Oh, thank you very much. What was her name, Janet?
Eula Benivolsky.
Benivolski, Benivolsky. So the other thing I want to say is, the first commentary I wrote for the Berkeley Daily, for the Daily Californian, the first commentary I wrote on this issue was about Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King and the Black church said that Black Americans were the chosen people too, but that they weren't the better chosen people than anyone else, but the chosen people too. And the reason was, he and the Black church said, that a people who suffered so much for centuries were chosen by God to be a special consciousness. And so for Martin Luther King, the promised land was not a piece of real estate. It was a place in the heart. The promised land was a just society. Getting back to criticism of Israel, as strong an anti-Zionist and critic of Israel as I've been for many, many years, I think that maybe I can recall one time that the Zionists or any Zionists have ever accused me of being anti-Semitic. And I'd have to think if it even happened once, because I, like Malcolm X said, well, Malcolm X said it first, that stick don't hurt me. And the Zionists have always known that I don't care. I don't give an F if they call me anti-Semitic. And amazingly enough, that seems to have provided me with a shield that I think maybe once, if that, because I just stick to the basic morality of the issue, just like Ta-Nehisi Coates said in his Democracy Now! Appearance. It's not that hard. And Malcolm X also said, the Zionist argument for the colonization of Palestine has no logical or intelligent basis in history. With regard to another person,
we're getting close to the end here.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll wrap up. Another person speaking about, standing up against false accusations of anti-Semitism on the Charlie Rose show years ago. I can't remember who it was, but there was a guy on the Charlie Rose show with Martin Indyk, I believe it was. And the guy said something, and Martin Indyk came back and tried to insinuate that guy was falsely insinuate that guy was being anti-Semitic. And that guy stood up to Martin Indyk. He said, "Oh, give me a break. You're not going there, are you?" And Martin Indyk backed right down. The very last thing I'll say, there's an elderly French Jewish Holocaust refugee who, I hope he's still alive, but he used to live at the Rosewood Gardens in Berkeley. And he went to Israel in the early 1950s. He mentioned incidents of anti-Palestinian racism so awful that I, as a non-Jew, would not repeat them because the Zionists would accuse me of making them up. And he said the only thing any moral Jew can do in Israel is leave. Thank you.
Okay, next is Jean. Go ahead, unmute.
I think you can hear me now, probably.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I really want to thank the participants, the speakers, on this, for raising this issue, which is really important. I just want to appreciate everything I've learned here. But also want to say, first of all, it's never been clear to me. I mean, Israel as a white settler state, how it's different what they're doing than what we did earlier in terms of Native Americans here in the United States. And if there's a difference, maybe somebody can clarify that for me. And the other thing I want to say more immediately is I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, and we're concerned about our government intervening in the affairs of other countries. But we see in this case is the United States is providing military, financial, diplomatic cover for the Israeli operations in Israel. They're being funded by the United States. The United States, I believe, is providing diplomatic cover in terms of blocking any UN resolution against what Israel is doing. So I just think, and again, I believe there are U.S. warships, 2 aircraft carriers settling in on the coast of Gaza there. So I think these things are very important, and I think it's important that we're aware of the way in which United States is behind this, and and Biden is saying, well, we want to make sure that they handle this in a humane manner, as if that's possible. So I just want to say that. Thank you.
Okay, just to wrap things up, I don't see any other hands in on the participants list. I'd like to make a quick comment. Why is it that there's so much adamancy about condemning anti-Semitism in response to criticism of Israel? Is it because of like the high moral character of the American political establishment? I think that one thing we really need to keep in mind is that this has to do with the fact that Israel is inextricably tied to the interests of the United States in the Middle East, to suppress nationalist movements, to maintain control over resources, has to do with the international financial system. This is what this is all about. And all of this other stuff is just a bunch of smokescreen on top of what's really taking place underneath. I have to say that I'm really very pleased and very proud that our planning committee, the people that made presentations today, take a very uncompromising attitude about this question in support of the Palestinians and against imperialism. And this is one of the few places that you can actually hear that type of perspective from a historical, personal, and political point of view. So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. We'll stop the recording, and I want to thank you, and stay tuned to find out about our next presentation. Check our website. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.